First up, thank you all so much for taking the time. Super excited for the conversation. So in this session, we're going to continue our conversation about how to build a learning culture, and we're going to do it in a pretty unique way. So for some companies like Nike, their growth is largely driven by marketing, right? They're really a marketing-driven growth company. For companies like Salesforce, it's more of a sales-led growth company. For companies like Figma, more of a design and product-led growth company. And what we're going to discuss today is what a learning-led growth company looks like. And the primary goal of our discussion is to both understand what that looks like, but also to get a sense of what it would take for learning to be the primary growth driver in an organization. Part of the session description also involves a conversation around a 45-year employee. To be honest, that's probably not realistic, right? For having an employee for 45 years may not be realistic and may not even be a good thing. But I think it's a really important point of conversation to think about what is holding organizations back and what is holding individuals back from being at a company and performing exceptionally well for 45 years or even for longer than 2 years, right? So that's going to be part of the conversation. So in terms of the structure, we're going to start with discussing why a 45-year employee isn't realistic, and more broadly, why employees leave, right? We'll then dive into what it's going to take for employees to continue developing and improving performance and for learning to really drive growth. And then we're going to spend some time talking about tactics and the art of the possible and what it's really going to take to bring this vision to reality. So, Tracy, my first question is to you. First off, what is keeping us from retaining talent for 45 years or even 2 years? And is that even a good goal from a performance point of view?
Thanks, Michael. Interesting, when you think about the life cycle of employees, team members, associates, whatever they're called within your organization, in most cases, most organizations' talent management and learning and development processes are not designed to sustain a person who would stay under your care for that period of time. So, the bit of the question of the 45-year employee is a bit of a fallacy, because if you did have a person staying there for that period of time, you have to question, are they performing? Are they contributing? Are they actually engaged? Has the environment actually set them up for success ongoing over the period of 45 years? I would say that in my experience, that doesn't exist. While it's a great goal to strive toward, there are constraints around engagement, around DE&I, around learning and performance goals that really preclude us from being able to do that effectively.
And let's dive into some of those constraints. Jack, I'm curious from your point of view, what is your perspective on the incentives in place that are causing employees to churn and that limit employee performance in a continuous fashion?
Say it again, I missed the incentives?
Yes, yeah, like the incentives within an organization, or what organizational structures are holding people back from continuing to develop and continue to grow and are ultimately causing people to leave as well.
Yes, so first of all, it's the misvalue proposition around a company being human-centric or people-centric. When you think about L&D, as I was sharing last night, L&D sits in HR. HR is typically the least funded function, respectfully, of all the corporate functions. And then you have organization development, you have total rewards, talent acquisition. So when you look at all the other COEs and you look at L&D, it already is starting at a disadvantage on top of not having affinity for investing in people. So that's our starting space, is to know where we sit. And it does prohibit this idea around leading in growth from a learning perspective. Is it possible? Of course. But I think we have to be armed with the right tools. We have to have, I would say, radical disruption, like collectively, like all of us on one accord, to step out of our comfort zone and be uncomfortable pushing the envelope if we're going to go into this direction around leading from learning.
And Mark, I'm curious, I know one of the things that we discuss is that oftentimes, right, given the constraints that many L&D organizations work with, today, most learning programs are designed and are optimized around the fact that people will leave after 2 to 3 or 4 years. If we were to design programs with an infinite point of view, right? If we were to design programs that optimize for retaining and developing people over a longer point of time, what needs to change from a design and development point of view?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. If you, I'm a huge fan of the whole Infinite game. If you guys have ever seen Simon Sinek and the Infinite, game when it comes to business, we got to think about that from a learning perspective as well. I'm a huge nerd. I love video games, and there's all these. If you play any game like Candy Crush or something like that on your phone, there's like these arcs that go through the game. You play for a little bit, you get a reward, you're engaged. It takes a little bit longer to get the next reward. Maybe you're a little less engaged, and by the time you hit level 10, 15, 20, you're like, yeah, this is so repetitive. I'm kind of done playing this game. That's what happens in learning, right? We do the same thing, and we make that first 10 to 15 levels, right? Like, oh, here, you're a new hire, take this class, and this class, and then, oh, you become a manager, take this class and this, and then there's these huge spaces where we don't do anything intentionally for people until they hit that trigger point. And if you think about the infinite game, how do we think about those very short arcs, the medium arcs, the long arc of an entire career? And then how do you think systematically about your programs? Where if you had a 45-year employee and you had somebody that came in through your onboarding program and then went to their technical development, then went to manager or whatever leadership, and then they went on, how does that whole journey look for the employee? And are those messages aligned and reinforcing of each other? Or as you get to different stages, like the messaging changes and you actually create more confusion for the employee? If you think that infinite game, like we're gonna have them forever, although I would argue I don't necessarily want them forever, right? I think fresh ideas from outside is also a good thing. But think about those things in arcs, and how can we then leverage that longer view for our development versus I've got to make this class, it's going to be 3 days long, and it's just done, right? So think of it as a continuum of programs.
Yeah, no, makes a ton of sense, and I think that continuous approach matters immensely, especially as we think about keeping people for a longer time and letting them know that they are being invested in over a longer period of time as well, right? Kelvin, I know something we discussed earlier were some of the barriers in place that often keep employees in roles they don't want, or prevent employees from getting the roles that they want, or even access to learning experiences that will get them to the next level. Can you tell me more about some of the barriers in place and what is holding employees and organizations back?
Wow, that's a great question, Michael. And when I just think about our title, like learning-led growth and the 45-year employee, let's just say hypothetically today, if someone's been with you 45 years, and say they had a work permit, they started at 15. How old is that employee today? 60. So you're talking about, as we mentioned yesterday, 5 different generations. So how do you connect with those? From the traditionalists, your baby boomers, who this 45-year employee, they started at 15, and then you go to your millennials, and then you go to your Generation X, and then you had Generation Z. So in your area and expertise, that's a pretty good question, Michael, because how do you connect the dots for all of those generations and keep them highly engaged? And to your point, do you want them around if they're not? But what do we do to make it conducive to their learning environment so they want to stay and contribute to your organization? You want those legacy employees to be able to tell, come work at this organization. But what are you doing to make sure that Generation Z says, hey, I see this is a career path to do what they're doing 45 years later? So I think that's kind of the work. But I think our exercise earlier with Andre around culture centers around how you could get an employee to be here 45 years.
And Tracy, I'm curious, with that in mind, from your vantage point, if a company truly grew because of investments in people and because of investments in learning, if a company truly embodied learning-led growth, what would that look like? And what would the initial steps an organization have to take? What would those look like?
Yeah, that's a great goal, to have, but it requires a lot of work. I mean, I like the point that Jackie made, before about being very intentional, being very purposeful, and being focused. As a leader in an L&D function, one of the things that I have to realize early on is that it's not going to happen if I'm the only person pushing it. It's got to be a collaborative effort, aligning myself, linking arms with other business leaders within the organization, and helping them not only understand but embrace that culture and values leveraged through learning, leveraged through D&I programs as a part of their business strategy. Because unless L&D is a part of the business strategy, it goes nowhere. It absolutely goes nowhere. We're spinning our wheels, just, spinning a pipe dream. So we've got to align very quickly and identify, how do we embed learning as a part of the culture of running the business? Because once we can do that, we have the opportunity to aspire toward that 45-year employee. I was sharing with some that I've had the opportunity to encounter some members of American Airlines who have actually been with the airline for over 60 years. It's amazing to me, even when I've met them and when I asked them why, they said, not for the larger organization, but within my work group, we have a culture. We have some dynamics that drive performance. We have a set of shared accountabilities. When you can build that into the business practice and frame that as a part of the larger business strategy, then you have a shot. It may only be a small shot, but you have a shot.
Without a doubt.
On the business piece, because I think that's fundamental for it to be anything to do with growth. It has to be tethered to business. And if we can shift the mindset of problem solving through learning enablement, like that's how we approach learning. And go-to-market strategy is this sense of knowledge and this sense of continuous improvement that's coming through the enablement of L&D. That's an ocean apart of having that as a mindset with our business leaders. So we have to sit with our business leaders and ask them, what are the goals and objectives? How are they defining their go-to-market strategy, and how can we help them accomplish that and measure our direct impact on them achieving their objectives? And I don't know that we're having those transparent and fundamental conversation quarterly or annually, if at all.
I mean, it's almost as if we need to shift both our mindset, but also the mindset of the business in terms of what we can offer, right? How we can support their goals. I'm curious, tactically, what are the initial steps that we can take to both elevate the role of DEI and L&D within an organization and demonstrate the value that we provide to the business units, but also to start building those relationships?
How many in the room practice DE&I, or that you lead your L&D function with a lens of inclusion, by show of hands? So we have to start there, because it was like half of the room. And the premise of having a learning-led growth organization is all of us have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? So if it's going to be learning-led, then we have to make sure learning is accessible to everybody. And quite honest, especially when it comes to development, it's not. If you look at your frontline employees, they don't have access to some of the training and materials that people who are in the office. So start with that lens of inclusion as to how we structure and process and design our strategy and our approach. So said another way, if you don't have a psychological safe person on your team to talk to in this D&I space, I would recommend that you find somebody to peer up with to help you look at the blind spots that naturally wouldn't surface for you because it's just not your experience. But that would help. That would help.
I think Jackie touched on something that I think is highly relevant to this group. And as we think about whether it's L&D or it's D&I, we work collaboratively together. It shouldn't be thinking tunnel vision that, hey, I got my focus, you have your focus. To be successful, you have to work collaboratively. But we think about the what, we think about the how, and the why. And so we know what the what is. It's all these great tools we've talked about. But the how is relatively important. MIT Sloan did a study or survey around the Great Resignation, and they wanted to know what's the top 5 reason people are leaving. The number 1 thing was disrespectful. Number 2, non-inclusive. Number 3, unethical. Number 4, cutthroat. And number 5, abusive. So if we don't find a way to move those out, and we got to trust, if MIT is saying it's pretty credible, we have to trust how do we start there and build off of that, because we can have the best trainings, the best philosophies, but if we have that type of a culture, we won't get very far.
And out of curiosity, when it comes to thinking about our programs, right, the programs that everybody in this room creates, what can we do to start and to start thinking about what some of those barriers are, right? Because at the end of the day, as Andre mentioned, our job is to bring people together and is to shape culture in many ways. And so, how can we be more cognizant of those barriers and of the impact that we're having?
To your point, so I can share a story that worked for our organization. So we did have all 5 of those generations. I wanted to understand how do we connect to them. So we created mentorship programs, and we did a reverse mentorship program with our millennials and our baby boomers, our traditionalists. And it was amazing. Our traditionalists and baby boomers were able to inspire the millennials around work ethic, what they did to get where they were, some of their stories of history of what it looked like coming through that career path. Millennials were able to help them with how to send an email out tomorrow morning at 7 instead of it going out tonight at 9. How to do an effective PowerPoint where you actually have moving parts coming in. And the executive team, the C-suite, was blown away with the level of talent in millennial. Half of our organization is millennials. So if you look at your analytics and you know your generations, because it's a big part of DE&I, ageism is highly important. 2025, there's the ability for 80 million baby boomers to exit the workforce. So we talk about the Great Resignation. What's our plan for that?
I'd like to add on to that too. Another thing you can do is look at your own teams that are designing these programs, right? And if you don't have diversity of thought, diversity of representation in, frontline workers, executives, mid-levels, all those different elements we just talked about that we have in the workforce, and if you look at your teams doing the design and analysis, if they're not having experience in those spaces, they're going to miss those elements that would normally, as soon as you go and take that class to the factory floor and they roll their eyes like this is garbage, that's why, because somebody that's never been on the factory floor made that training, and they make assumptions about what is right and what's the, so not only do we have to think about what we're, how we're embracing diversity and bringing it and making it accessible, we got to make sure that the design is being designed from that lens too. It's not just making it available, but it's how we design it.
So let's say that Mark is correct. We do need to have diversity on the team, but let's say we don't have any. We ain't getting any. It is what it is. What do I do? You go to Google University. As a practitioner, you should become informed. This is your space. Just because it's DE&I doesn't mean Mark owns it or Calvin owns it. You own it. So just like any other strategic initiative that your leadership has, empowered you to be responsible for integrating into the organization, go learn it. When it comes to this topic of DE&I, because you're not a part of a underrepresented, talented segment, doesn't mean you can't go and acquire the necessary knowledge, skill set, and attribute. It would be phenomenal as a L&D practitioner to come to the D&I officer and present the L&D strategy from a lens of inclusion, and allow him to just tweak or give feedback, because you've done, and you have exposure to all the tools and the content and the library. Like, you can do that. So that would be my radical disruption.
if I can just add to that, because Jackie, I agree with what you're saying. In many cases, I mean, I've spent the majority of my career working in the L&D space, and I've seen the ebb and flow of discussions. And what I find in many cases is that we, in the L&D space, and I've been guilty of this as well, we think about L&D in some sort of egalitarian or existential sort of fashion. This is for the greater good of the organization. But we don't think about it always in the economic perspective as business leaders of, here's how I'm adding value to your top and bottom line revenue. Here are the specific components and skill building elements that will actually add value, will add to our customer representation, will add to our diversity numbers, will add to our market share. And if you can't move yourself to that space, you actually need to get out of the way, because you're actually blocking the ability and the drive of those who want to do that and need to be in those conversations. That's where the conversation lies. That's where the resourcing lies, with being able to talk about our needs from a very economic place. Talk about, here's how I add value. Here's how this incremental increase in performance is going to enhance not only our retention, but our ongoing ability to drive results.
Yesterday, you said meet people where they are. And our goal, as we met yesterday as panelists, we said, we want to make sure you clearly get to go back and do a physical exam of who's in your network, because we want you to leave empowered. We want to leave as a group empowered to go back and make some really great things happen. But let's just face it, honestly, there's hierarchy in most organizations, and it'd be real easy to get exhausted. And my 6th word that I posted today is compassion without action is just observation. So you can have extreme compassion. But if you remember, if anyone in this room saw the movie Hidden Figures, did anybody see it? You remember the part where Taraji walks in and he says, "Where have you been? You leave every day 40 minutes. You remember that? You remember her reply? I have to go to the bathroom. It's half a mile away. It wasn't that it was a bad leader who didn't have compassion. He just didn't know. But when he shared it, when she shared that with him, did you see his facial expression? Did you see the room? And he went and took instant action. Remember that crowbar thing? That resonates with me, because that mantra, which I choose as my personal mantra, compassion without action, just observation. When I see something that needs to be corrected, I want to try to position myself, leverage my network to get the movement that I'm looking for.
Right. Yeah, I love this conversation. I hope you guys do too, because I want to go a little bit deeper than that. When I look at the title, Learning-Led Growth and the 45-year employee, I automatically think about DE&I, or people look like me, and say, we would never make 45 years, right? Because the playing field is just not leveled, or there's micro inequities, or unconscious bias. It's like you move on, right? You stay, keep your head down, or you lift it up, but you do what you can do until you can move on. So it has no resonance, because that's not achievable, not unless you are a mechanic and you're working on an assembly line and you're just doing this or something like that. But we know the reality. The title, from a D&I perspective, is an ocean apart because of the lived experience of a team member. And then from a learning-led growth perspective, we know that's just not happening. It's just not happening. And as passionate as we are about our practice, what are we holding ourselves accountable to do and to disrupt and challenge and move forward? Honestly, what are we? Because I don't think you can do those two without equity.
I completely agree. I think equity has to be the foundation, right? And I think it's interesting to what you mentioned earlier, right? So much of why people leave, right, is because they are not given the resources, they're not respected, right? There are organizational challenges in place that hold them back, and a lot of, pretty much all of them come down to inequities, right? If you've been in an organization where your work is not recognized because of your background, right, fundamentally, that's where so many of those challenges come in. So I'd love to learn from you all, what can we do to start breaking down some of those inequities?
So I'll add it to that. So if I think about the comment I made about like the diversity of developing the programs, I didn't necessarily mean hiring and staffing on your organizations, but diving into your network, as we talked about here, is who do you know that is in those groups that you can bounce the ideas off of and get that feedback, but then also evaluate your own network that's helping develop you, and think about, you know, how diverse of thought leadership is that. Like, if I look at my network and I'm like, wow, I got a bunch of CLOs in my network, that's not really diversity of thought. Like, I need business leaders, I need HR leaders, I need engineering leaders, right? And then I need them in different industries, and I want to, you know, so you think about your own network, and it's one of the things I always like to say is, it's not what you know. And a lot of people say it's not what you know, it's who you know. But I'll take it further. It's who knows what you know, right? Like, that's really where it helps you get. And then that, once you get into that network, you can get into their network, right? So you kind of figure out where do you have a gap in your network and in your vision of go, and then how do you get and fill those gaps, right? So that's something that you can do individually, but then that cascades to those that around you, and then it changes how you start to look at programs and design and even problem solving with leaders, right? Because you can start to meet them where they're at. Because even if you have the loftiest vision of where you want to go and they're nowhere near that, you don't have to get them to Shangri-La in one meeting. You just got to get them a couple steps closer, right? And it's going to be a journey. We're going to have to chip away at it, you know, over time. But I love that, your phrase there, compassion without action is just observation. I'm going to add that if you don't mind. Yeah. The one I wrote up there was, my 6-word memoir is an environment where I can be myself.
Same.
Mark's point, what he just mentioned, and I think Michael asked, what could you do now? My recommendation would be to be very on purpose about being curious, and be very on purpose about building, leveraging your business acumen. Most people want to know, how will this impact our bottom line? So when you go to, you're going to leave empowered and feeling like, I'm inspired, I want to go change, and you walk in the room and you're not really ready to share your business case, why? Then your mindset could get shut down as to, hey, we're not ready for that right now. Take the time, do your homework, build a roadmap and an executive summary, and be prepared how you will present it. Practice that and present it, and watch and see how it can catch legs and grow. Without that, for me, that was one of the most successful moves with our C-suite, was every time I approached, I looked for a way to walk in with a clear concept of what business acumen aligned with where they were trying to go from a mission, vision, values company-wide, and my strategies always aligned with it.
I think that's a really critical point, right? Because, sure, the people in this room are L&D and DEI leaders, but we really are business leaders, right, who happen to know that L&D and DEI is what makes an organization perform incredibly well and what drives the organization forward, right? Those are the levers that we use to create change in an organization and ultimately improve the performance of an organization, right? If employees feel respected, right, if employees know that the organization cares about their well-being, right, their psychological safety and their performance, right, they will do better and the organization will do better as a whole. And I'm curious, I'd love to learn from all of you, in terms of telling that story, right? We know that building relationships with the business is critical, and building that network is critical. What else can we do to tell that story and continue building those relationships internally from a really tactical point of view?
Of the collaboration between DE&I and L&D, what comes to me, and I wasn't in the exercise for the 6th word, but what I'm thinking of is one word called cosmetics, and the reason DE&I training or DE&I education has failed us over the last 10 to 15 years is because it is cosmetic. And when you think of the definition of cosmetic, it is to make something look beautiful and to promote it with all of its glory. And that's all we're doing, is promoting it. with all of its glory, but we're not changing anything within the ecosystem. With, some L&D professionals say that training involves behavior shift, like you need to see evidence of that transpiring. Do we see that? Or are we just putting lipstick on a systemic issue that continues to plague us, and we dance around it every 10 years? We reinvent it from, what was it? Diversity, then it was diversity and inclusion, now it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, now it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. That's all cosmetics.
You reminded me of, I have a good friend who went to police academy, and the first thing they had him do was swing at the air as hard as they could for a minute, and it wears you out because you're not hitting any resistance, you're not hitting anything. And sometimes I think we confuse effort with execution. So measure what matters, and when you can have those numbers to back up where you're trying to go in the analytics, I think it puts you in a better position to say, hey, we're seeing movement. And since the death of George Floyd, just be honest, most every organization, wants to, that is reputable, wanted a person in a DEIC, or to say, hey, we have a program. It's really not a program, it's a philosophy, it's a culture. So keep that in mind, measure what's mattering, and are your efforts really hitting, or your blows connecting to anything?
When I think of L&D skill set that we should all acquire is, one, storytelling, the ability to storytell. That should be number one. Number two, the ability to leverage analytics is huge. And then number three, we all need resilience as a core competency for L&D practitioners. So that would be my answer to what we could do.
I would echo that, and I think the sentiments are sound. In very practical, perspectives, we need to operate with the same level of granularity, our ability to capture how does this impact the business? What are the key metrics that we're driving? We need to position ourselves so that we can operate in the same way and with the same expectation that other business leaders in the enterprise have to operate. They need to understand the metrics that matter. They need to be able to articulate that. They need to be able to build the story with such a level of passion that it drives change within the organization. Otherwise, we're just talking. We're just observing. We're not actually in the room when the decisions are being made if we can't tell the story about the metrics that actually matter to drive the changes that impact the organization. So I would say to you, and it's a cautionary tale, because if we don't do that, then don't be surprised when you're not in the room when those critical decisions are being made. You've got to understand the basic business metrics. You've got to be able to speak in the language of the business, and you've got to speak to those L&D, D&I applications and the distinct measures within those that are going to drive business results. If you're not doing that, don't expect to be in the room. You shouldn't be.
Yeah, the other thing I think about in this whole space is, if you're doing, I'm sure, how many of you have unconscious bias training available at your companies? Right. How many of you have unconscious bias embedded in performance management discussion training? See, look at the difference there. Look at the difference there. Because they're not they're not separate. Right? You can't, if I do a more technical training type of analogy, if I was training you on how to use a ladder safely, right, there would be ladder safety class. But then if I went in the training on the factory floor to teach you a process that used ladder, we don't cover ladder safety, right? But then what happens is, in people's minds, is they're separate things. They're not combined. But if you get somebody and you teach that ladder safety in the middle of the process training, you've now starting to tie those two mental processes together. You got to do the same thing with our DE&I development, right? You have to make sure that it's not just an afterthought or the cosmetics. I love the analogy. Thank you for that. but it's absolutely a part and integrated in the messages that you're delivering from a leadership development, a manager development, even your process development. Are the processes that you're training on, you think about what is the different, accessibility that training. And, and a lot of times we talk about, oh, well, it's about visual impairment, or it's about, deaf and hard of hearing. We got to weave that stuff into, but you got to weave it all in. You can't just cherry pick on what we include and what we don't include. You got to have that message stream throughout. So.
I like what you said about the message, but I want to go back to Jackie's Cosmetics. So when you think in terms of how you can lead with three very important things, think about your head, heart, and hands. And your heart has to say, hey, there's a need for this, and it really has to have an impact. Then it has to go to your head, and it's only 12 inches from your brain to your heart. So it doesn't have far to travel. But once it gets in your head, be curious about the business side, the business mind, because you're talking to business professionals. And so have you really taken the time to see what's the forecast for the future? By 2030, what does the demographics look like? Where's the deficit going to be? Korn Ferry did a great survey, and it showed that there's going to be a deficit in skilled labor. So how do we plan for that? How do you walk in a room and help your organization see the need for that? But most importantly, head, heart, and hands. The hands is where your actions come to reality. How do you take it to reality and bring it home?
I think it's a really critical point, especially because as we think about telling the story to our organizations, right? I think a big part of it is also resetting the narrative, right? Because the reality is that the work that we do now will have a meaningful impact in 2030, right? These things take a lot of time. There's a lot of work to be done, right? And these things do have a longer time horizon, right? I think a big part of it is also coming back to the business and saying, hey, we know that you have these forecasts for the next 2 years, and the work that we're doing now will likely not support those forecasts, but what they will do is they'll set the foundation to support the forecasts for 2030 and 2040 and build that infinite game. And so with that in mind, Mark, I'd love to learn from you, what are the elements of a really, really compelling story, apart from the business metrics? And I'd love to hear maybe like an example of how you've been able to tell really, really effective stories internally.
One thing that comes to mind in that space is, I don't know if anybody here participates in the Paradigm for Parity, where the goal is to have executive leadership be 50% women, 50% men by 2030 is the long-term goal. And if you look at that, and people are making strides towards that, the problem is in learning, at least where I was at, we were not, I said, we have to get 50-50 representation in our classes now to build the pipeline so that there is people ready when those opportunities come up. And so, you have some of these initiatives that are, again, that longer term goal. Actions can we be taking right now that helps set up for that future? Because if we just said, oh, we're going to go to 30-70 this year, and in a couple years we'll go 80 or 60-40, and then we'll get to 50. By that time, the pipeline's not ready. You got to make take actions you can take now and go all the way. And you may not. You do have to meet your organizations where they're at, right? And I understand that, and I sit in a chair that allows me to push on that. But you really do have to ask yourselves, like, what can we be doing right now that helps move the needle so that longer term goal can be hit?
With that in mind, I guess we're sort of near the end of the conversation, and I want to ensure that we have some tactical guidance and some tactical next steps for everybody here. So I'm curious, as we think about managing up, navigating internal hurdles, building a network, building buy-in, and also resetting expectations for what all of us do for the business and how we work with the business to improve performance in the long run. What are your best pieces of guidance or advice for the audience of how to do that?
I would say if you're not if you're not comfortable from the business perspective, to get comfortable. If you're not comfortable from a D&I perspective, to get comfortable. So how do you do that? From a business perspective, start listening to the analyst call. Listen to what the CFO and the CEO is telling the street about what's important to the business. Secondly, start to have one-on-ones with your business unit leader. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. Start having coffee chats and going into the conversation, here's what I know on strategy. That's the point, that you need to be strategic. You can't always be tactical and just order taking and just delivering, services, that you really need to get ahead of the curve, listen in, and then, hey, this is what I've learned. Here's what I understand you need. Can we collaborate? So take the lead. Don't wait to be told is what I'm suggesting on the business side. What I'm suggesting on the D&I side, get rid of the lipstick and the foundation, and push the envelope. Push it when they come and say, let's do unconscious bias. Because unconscious bias, quite honestly, is just awareness. It's not helping people have the skills to unearth deeply held core beliefs. We're not equipping them to make adjustments around their core values and belief. We're only helping them to acknowledge what we all in this room have, which is clear bias. So the goal and objective on your training needs to be re-scripted, or the goal readjusted, not just awareness, but also on how do we give skill. So when you recognize yourself in a situation where you noticed a bias popped up, what do you do with that? And we don't have follow-up. Or we don't have errors sending us text messages to tell us what to do.
I would recommend that you be on purpose about benchmarking best practices. You have just technologies right at the touch of your fingertips. So Google what organizations have top best practices in all of these areas and take the time to research it. When I took this role, I actually researched 152 organizations' best practices in DE&I. And I sent the executive team a summary every day for 9 months until they said, stop, we get it. Now let's build our roadmap. But it did help me to see what is really working out there. And every organization's DNA is not yours. But you get to decide and pick and choose what could you pull from a best practice, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
I would echo certainly the things that have been mentioned. One of the things that I've challenged my team to do, we've established watch parties for our investor calls, because I need every member of my team to understand exactly what Jackie said. What is our CFO saying to the street? What do we understand about the current challenges of the business, how we're responding to those challenges, and what we're planning to do next? Because that's going to drive where is the focus on skills? Where are the resources going to be? What are the things that we need to be doing? So understand the language of the business and the metrics that matter, and build your strategy around those, as well as here's the things you left out that maybe we should also consider. Okay, I want to address the strategic drivers that you've already identified, and here's how we're going to address those. But I also want to pique your awareness to here's some things that fall within the space that we also need to be impacting. Tell your story, but also tell your story in the context of where the business is trying to go.
Yeah, and then I think the thing that I try to lead with is empathy, is try to understand the person sitting across from you's situation, right? Ask questions. I really subscribe to the concept of attribution error. So you want deep personal connections with people. If you don't know who they are and don't have a connection with them, you attribute their behavior to their character. If you do know them, you attribute their behavior to their environment. And so with that, you want to know people. And then that, because you understand, I truly believe, especially in a corporate world, that people don't get up and say, I'm going to go in and do a crappy job today. I'm going to go and make all kinds of problems. I mean, there are some sociopaths, and we get that, but for the most part, people are good. And so if you lead with that, you try to understand where they're coming from. Why did they push that, or why did they say this? Well, they may not have the knowledge or the vocabulary to express better how they feel or what their decision making are. Help them understand better, but don't don't attribute that to their character, because you just don't know where they're at. There's situations that you, just like Andre this morning, like there's stuff holding us all back right now for some reason, right? Ask somebody. Has anybody in here asked what that was on somebody else's paper today? What is holding somebody back? Get to know people, and then, and especially in your organizations and in your businesses, you'll really then understand what are some of those underlying motivations, and that's really at the heart of empathy. So,
Incredible. Thank you all so much. Before I pass it over to Shannon, I just want to recap some of the core items that we discussed, just so you all have some sort of final items to take home, right? The first is assume good intent. Right, assume good intent whenever you're working with the folks in the business, and whenever you're working with folks, within your team. Really try to understand what is motivating them, what's holding them back, and what the challenges are. Also, build relationships. Right, the change that we all are working to create is both change that happens in the long run, but also is change that can only happen if we build really, really strong relationships with all parts of the business and are extremely clear about the fact that this is an alliance that we are working together to not only improve performance, but also to break down the barriers that are holding performance back fundamentally, right? And then also, I think a really, really critical point is when we're looking at our learning and development activities, right, and what we're doing internally, really, really thinking about, is this accessible? Is this something that anybody can really take and can access? And fundamentally, are the things that we're doing, are they holding people back from developing, and are they causing them to churn because we are not considering access and because we're not considering the inequities that naturally exist in some of the experiences that we create? So thank you all so much, and I will pass it over to Shannon. Thank you all for taking the time.